name is Diana Batista. I am the new chair of this committee. I'm so happy to see you all today. So we'll start with introductions. Matthew, we'll save you for last since you are our speaker today. That way you know who's in the room. So I'll start. My name is Diana Batista. I am the Government Relations Manager for Lucile Packard Children's Hospital, Stanford. And I'm just going to call on people. So be ready. Kathy.
Hello, I'm the Director of Finance at Los Altos Community Foundation and also the Treasurer of the Board of the Chamber.
Okay. Dennis.
Excuse the background noise. I'm a board member of the Chamber and co-publisher of the Los Altos Town Crier.
Awesome. Gary.
Good morning, Diana. I'm the board president for the Los Altos History Museum and the board president for Greentown Los Altos. And we just published our Lunch with Greentown's 10 Talks lecture series on YouTube. You can search for it on Lunch with Greentown.
Awesome. Feel free to put stuff like that in the chat. We want this to be a little interactive as well. Alex.
Alex Kobayashi from Senator Josh Becker's office.
Who is an awesome representative. Thank you so much, Alex, for being here. Anthony.
Hi, my name is Anthony Carnesecca. I'm the Economic Development Coordinator for the City of Los Altos.
As a spoiler, Councilmember Weinberg.
Good morning, Jonathan Weinberg, member of the council.
Initials DH. Kim, do you know?
I don't know. It's my brain teaser this morning. I don't.
All right. Well,
we have a party crasher.
DH, whenever you want to introduce yourself, please do. Bruce.
Oh, Bruce Barton. I don't know if you can hear us, Bruce. Bruce Barton is with Los Altos Town Crier, a reporter.
Okay.
Yesterday was his birthday, so he's probably recovering.
Happy birthday, Bruce. Okay, and Kim, please.
Sure. Kim Mosley, president of the Los Altos Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
We have a great speaker today. We are going to be talking housing market dynamics in the Bay Area. And I will let Matthew introduce himself a little bit, but I was given his bio. And since I know how to follow orders, I was raised by the nuns, I will read what was given to me. Matthew earned his doctorate in public policy and management from the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at Ohio State University. Are those Buckeyes?
That is the Buckeyes. Go Bucks.
Prior to finishing his post-secondary schooling, Matthew worked as a real estate appraiser and appraisal reviewer before and during the U.S. housing crisis of 2007-2008. In addition, he worked as a policy research assistant at the Ohio Housing Finance Agency in 2013 and 2014, and worked under a research contract for Fannie Mae from 2015 till 2017. Matthew's research focuses on the substantive policy areas of civic engagement, affordable home ownership, and community building, as well as how politics and the policy-making environment influence service delivery in public agencies. At Ohio State, Matthew taught Intro to Public Affairs, Civic Engagement, and Policy Analysis at the undergraduate level. He joined the San Jose State faculty in 2017 and teaches graduate research methods and policy analysis, as well as undergraduate U.S. history and government. All right, Matthew, don't know if you want to add anything more or if you just want to go ahead and start your presentation.
I guess the one last bit of my bio that we did not is that I actually am moving on from San Jose State University this semester. So unfortunately, I will be heading on back out to the Midwest to Drake University. So
speaking of housing affordability, I'm going to assume so.
That is, I have been having that discussion with my current colleagues. Is that I love San Jose State. I wish I could kind of pick San Jose State up and place it exactly as it is in a place with more reasonable cost of living. But yeah, that's, I mean, so I'm going to be talking about a lot of this stuff from kind of a very academic perspective, but really it has a visceral reality to me because it's you know, impacting my life choices in a pretty drastic way. Just really quickly, I think Kim, you're the host. I think I need to be made a co-host or I'm not going to be able to share my slides.
Sure.
And while Kim does that, if you all want to put in your questions into the chat box, or you can wait till the very end and then you can just speak to Matthew, that's fine.
Yeah, so I have a lot of stuff, but I'm going to kind of go through it pretty quickly. Nothing's really all that revolutionary. I'm guessing most of it aren't things that you haven't heard before. So you know, the Q&A will probably be the more useful part to all of you. But thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Matthew Record, assistant professor at San Jose State, and today I'm going to be talking very broadly about housing market dynamics in the Bay Area. And like I said, I don't think any of this is going to be stuff you haven't heard before, but I'm hoping to reframe it slightly so that maybe it activates things in a way that you haven't thought about it before, or you know, just elicits some questions or thought in your own head that, you know, might not have come up previously. So I'm going to kind of start with a quick case study. And the reason that I start with this case study is not because New York City is so rip-roaring awesome. Actually, what's interesting is that I'm going to compare the Bay Area to New York City. And what's interesting is that New York City is a place that's regarded as having a housing crisis, a housing affordability crisis, and yet still isn't dealing with the kind of magnitude of housing problem that we are here in the Bay Area or even in California more generally. So it kind of stands to reason why. And in that framing, hopefully it'll set us up for the remainder of the conversation. So here are the 9 counties of the Bay Area. And this isn't exactly perfect, but it's pretty close. For scale, here are the 5 boroughs of New York City. That really is how small New York City is relative to the larger Bay Area. And so when you look at the land mass that we are dealing with here in the Bay Area, it is much, much, much larger than New York City, but our population is actually a little bit smaller. So one of the things that you might think drives housing prices are like, well, space availability. And we in the Bay Area really are kind of out of developable space. But it's just interesting to note that like other places are dealing with even less space than we are and kind of manage to navigate this. We are not as rich as New York City. On average, their GDP, they're not on average, in total, their GDP is a little bit more than 50% larger than ours. So even on a per person basis, there's just more money in the system in New York City. But the average house price is like almost half of what it is out here. Rent is a little bit lower in New York City on average than it is here. Obviously, this is going to depend location to location. So for instance, Queens, the kind of farthest eastern portion of New York City, has much cheaper rents than the rest of the city. And there are parts of the Bay Area that obviously have lower rents than San Jose or Mountain View or San Francisco. But on average, their housing costs are cheaper than ours, which, given the fact that they have more people in less space with more money chasing the available housing, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Those are the things that should be driving housing costs. The real reason why New York City actually manages to end up with lower housing costs than we do is because they've just got more housing units than we do, about 10% more on a per person basis. So that framing kind of leads us into this motion, this kind of like discussion of like, how is it that we are, don't get me wrong, this is an economically vibrant location, but we are not the richest place in the world. We have geographical constraints, water, mountains, other environmental concerns that prevent us from building on all of the land available to us in those 9 counties, but we are not the most geographically constrained location. So we're not the richest, we're not the most constrained, we're not the biggest. So what happened? How did we get here? So first, I'm going to talk about some of the most common explanations that I've heard just in my studies and in my conversations with people. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about what I see as the more relevant consideration. So here we're going to be talking about what I like to refer to as myths and easy answers. Some of these have more than a kernel of truth to them. Some of these are total red herrings, and we'll talk about them each in turn. The first is immigration. California has the largest immigrant population of any state in the country. And obviously, when you get lots and lots of inflows of people, you are going to see a situation in which a greater number of people are chasing the available housing. So that would push prices up. We're competing against one another. I remember my wife and I were looking for an apartment. I think it was somewhere out in Campbell. And it was like the apartment was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. But I remember there was just all these people milling around that I made a comment to my wife of like, are all of these people here to see this apartment? And the answer was yes. Real estate agent came up, they unlocked the door, and it was like pandemonium. It was like it's a mad world or something. Everybody ran into this unit. This like not at all spectacular unit, and like was all looking around. And I looked at it for like 3 minutes. And I went to my wife. I was like, I'm not competing with 50 people for this apartment that I don't even want that much. Like, it would, so yeah, when you have lots and lots of people chasing a relatively small housing stock, that is going to push prices up. But the fact of the matter is, while immigration is high in California relative to the United States and relative to basically every other state in the union, it's not really that high by historical standards. We are at roughly the level of immigrant non-native born population in the state of California that we were at about 110 years ago. And while it is substantially higher than what we saw in, say, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, nationwide, the 50s, 60s, and 70s were a very unusual period for immigration in the United States, in the sense that we were coming off a world war, we were coming off a depression, and immigration worldwide was just kind of down. So once the United States returned to roughly its typical level of immigration, that's what we see now. And you'll see in recent years, it's leveled off and even gone down a little bit. We haven't seen a substantial increase in immigration in the state of California in about 20 years, maybe a little bit longer. And yet housing prices continue to creep up. So that pattern doesn't match exactly. The kind of big push of immigrants into the state might have kind of started us on this road of super expensive housing, but it's not what's keeping the engine driving now. The other thing is, as I'm sure most of you are aware, in terms of like interior United States immigration, so migration in and out, not with people from other countries, but people from other states, California has had a net outflow of domestic immigration for like 30, 35 years at this point. So while it is true that California is an attractive location for people from outside of the country to move into, California is actually not a particularly attractive location for native-born Americans, where they are kind of moving to Oregon and Arizona and Texas and other parts of the country. So what's interesting is that despite the fact that California is such a kind of like attractive destination for immigration, California's population growth is actually down substantially. So I was saying it's been about 100 years ago that we saw this level of immigration in the state. It's been about 80, 85 years since we've seen this low a level of population growth here in California. So throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, population growth was pretty enormous. If you look at that blue line, that's kind of what I'm going to baseline the level of population growth that we have seen in about the last 15 years, since roughly 2005, 2006, something like that. And we haven't seen population growth that low since before World War II. More recently, in just the past few years, we've seen so little population growth that baseline's more to like the 20s and the 30s, like kind of back before California was California in a lot of ways. So there's a real sense that the population of California is slowing and maturing, not unlike New York or Massachusetts or a lot of the northeastern states that we are in a lot of ways socially and politically the most similar to. This might be a dynamic that continues into the future, or it might not. But the important thing to note here is that there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that population growth in and of itself is what's driving housing prices, because we dealt with way bigger population growth than this in the past, and we absorbed it a lot more effectively than we have been in recent years. Another explanation that you will consistently hear is that California, and the Bay Area specifically, is an attractive location for foreign buyers to kind of like buy homes and park their wealth, especially buyers from, say, China, where they, because of the way that the autocratic governments that they are a part of, kind of this newly christened upper middle class and upper class group of Chinese nationals would rather stash their money in kind of Western Europe or in Singapore, Malaysia, or here in the United States. And real estate is a really attractive place to put that. And there's not no truth to that. There are a pretty, on the margins, pretty substantial number of purchases that are being made from non-US citizens. So a lot of people suggest that, well, there's just a lot of, say, Chinese buyers coming in here into the Bay Area, buying up expensive houses and then just letting them sit empty because it's just a way for them to park their money in an investment vehicle that'll grow over time. But that doesn't actually happen, or it does, but not in the way that implies. So to begin with, China has only just recently become the most common country of origin for foreign buyers. It was actually Canada up until very recently. Mexico, the United Kingdom, and India are also up there. So while it is true that, it's kind of normal, right? China has come out of a long period where a huge portion of their population was living in poverty for generation after generation. So like, China's a growing economy. It will probably supplant us as the largest economy in the world within the next 10 years or so. So just a whole bunch of people with a lot of money, right? They're naturally going to start buying assets, and some of those assets are going to be abroad. Nonetheless, though, when you look at just the total amount of foreign purchases over time, it's just not that large. Those are those little strips down there at the bottom. If you see the little black strips, those are purchases that are being made by non-resident, non-citizens. So those are like the kind of stereotypical description of somebody who comes in, buys a home, and then maybe does nothing with it. But even then, they usually rent it out. And that little red strip down at the bottom, those are purchases by non-citizens, but they are non-citizens that live here in California. So like, they're probably people that are going to become citizens in relatively short order, or even if they are not, they're still living here. So there's kind of like that stereotype doesn't really have that much bearing in reality. If we look at, and this is like a super academic way of constructing this, but price elasticity, essentially how much are prices impacted by purchases from foreign buyers. This is a list of the cities in the US that are least impacted by that practice. And as you can see, of the sort of 40 or so cities that they examined, California cities are near the bottom. In fact, we don't rank anywhere higher than 14th, unless I missed one. I don't think I did. And San Francisco, Oakland specifically, is least responsive to these kind of foreign purchases. In other words, while these purchases from foreign buyers do have an impact on prices, the best information that we have suggests that even if we stop that practice completely, even if it was never the case that somebody from a foreign country bought real estate here in the Bay Area, which, by the way, has never been the case previously, it really wouldn't impact prices all that much. And again, the reason for that is because the vast, vast, vast majority of purchases that are done here in the state of California are done by US citizens, and most of them are done by US citizens who plan to live in the house that they are buying. So, and that number actually is creeping up. So the number of foreign purchases is actually going down. So yes, on the margins, again, when you have more people chasing a housing stock, that is going to push prices up. But the fact of the matter is, foreign buyers are just not a huge portion of that demand side equation. Another argument that you will see is that, well, there's a lot of people that are buying homes and then like just leaving them empty. And it is true that the vacancy rate in San Francisco specifically is higher than you would expect given how high the prices are. And the home ownership rate in California is down from its peak in the mid 2000s. But the home ownership rate everywhere is down since its height in the mid 2000s. And that's not just nationwide, that's worldwide with some exceptions. So California is really not out of line with the rest of the country in terms of this question of owner occupancy and home ownership. Another argument that you'll hear is interest rates. Interest rates are pushing lots and lots of people to buy houses who wouldn't otherwise. That's increasing demand, and that's leading to higher prices. And again, on the margins, that's true. Lower interest rates do spur demand, but they usually only really spur short-term demand. And except for a kind of brief spike in the late 2000s, right before and after the housing crisis, interest rates have been at or near historic lows, like for a long time. Like I didn't date this chart back to the 80s, but in the 80s, interest rates were higher than you see here. In the 70s, interest rates were higher than then. We've been basically on a downward trajectory with interest rates for like 40 years. And then starting in like roughly 2009, we basically completely flattened off. So to the extent that interest rates are spurring investment and participation in the real estate market, which is true, I mean, it's kind of baked into the cake at this point. Like there's not really going to be that much, like on a long enough timeline, people kind of get used to things. And the interest rate has been low for a really long time, right? So it's not like somebody's going to suddenly wake up tomorrow and go, oh my God, interest rates are so low, I have to buy a house right now. Like they probably would have had that realization several months ago or several years ago or whatever. So you can raise interest rates and that will kind of tamp down demand a little bit. But one of the main problems with housing being as high as it is that it excludes lots of people, right? Especially younger people, lower income people from being able to participate in the housing system. Well, raising interest rates definitely excludes those same groups of people. Finally, I think this is the one that I hear the most common. It's Google and Apple's fault. And this is the one that's actually probably the closest to something that's real. But saying it's Google and Apple's fault is obviously a little bit of a, that's a little glib. But it is true that the economy, while we are not the biggest economy in the country, we are the fastest growing economy among large metropolitan areas. And there is something to be said for the idea that when the economy is growing very, very quickly, as it is in San Jose and San Francisco, it's hard for the built environment to keep up. So when you have a situation where the housing stock is relatively limited and you have this large influx of relatively wealthy programmers and other employees for these relatively wealthy companies, yeah, that's going to drive prices up. But it's important to note that while we are the fastest growing economy among large cities today, we are not the largest growing economy like ever. Like you can look back to moments of, say, Detroit in the 1940s or other major cities at other points in history, and they were growing as fast or faster than we are, and yet they were able to absorb that extra money into the system, that extra demand into the system more effectively than we have been recently. So I've been dancing around this. I have mentioned this in almost every single one of my explanations, is that whatever demand side thing you attribute these major problems to, the real problem is supply. There is a massive undersupply of housing here in the Bay Area and in California more generally. I actually just got a comment in the chat about how New York has a higher density of housing. Yes, it does. New York between 1870 and about 1930, so not that long, less than one human lifetime, added about 5.5 million people to its population. And the built environment of New York transformed to reflect that over that same period of time. In 1876, the Brooklyn Bridge wasn't even built yet, but that was the largest structure in the city at the time. By 1931, the largest structure was the Empire State Building, which was, don't hold me to this number, but something like 25 or 30 times larger than the Brooklyn Bridge. So there was a massive change in the built environment of New York City, because to the east, there was incorporated territory. To the north, it was Yonkers, New York. To the west, there was Elizabeth, New Jersey, and it was surrounded on all sides by rivers. They couldn't build out anymore. So the only thing that was left to do was to build up. Meanwhile, here in the Bay, we've seen roughly a similar level of population growth between 1950 and today. And yet the built environment in the Bay and through much of the rest of California looks roughly similar to what it did 70 years ago, which is to say lots and lots and lots of sprawling single family houses. And yeah, we've kind of built deeper into the Coyote Valley and kind of deeper out towards into the mountains and deeper out into the woods and all that. But for the most part, we're out of space. I mean, there's kind of, we could roll back some environmental regulations or whatever, maybe free up a little bit of space here and there. But for the most part, there's like mountains and water and other terrain that we really can't safely build on, especially not in a place that has lots of earthquakes. So again, once you can't build out anymore, the only thing left to do is to build up. But the Bay Area has been not uniquely resistant to that, but the magnitude of the resistance has probably been greater than what we've seen in just about any other part of the country. Of the top 60 most densely populated counties in the country, only 3 of them are in California, which is surprising because California has the largest population of any state in the country by a wide margin. Now, obviously, we got lots of space, so we can kind of afford to be a little bit more spread out. But still, it is a little bit shocking that Los Angeles County is the second largest county in the entirety of the United States, but it's 56th in its level of density. San Francisco County itself is pretty dense. It's actually the only city in the country that can rival the northeastern cities for its level of density out here in the West, I mean. But other than that, the rest of the 8 counties of the Bay Area don't even register. San Jose has roughly the population density of the city of Pittsburgh, but we have a much, much smaller population. We have half the population density. Alexandria, Virginia, which I don't regard as like a major city, has twice the population density that we do. If you take the entire Bay Area, the 9 counties of the Bay Area, we actually collectively have less population density than Suffolk County, New York, where I come from, which is on Long Island, like the archetypal suburb, right? So like we're basically a little bit of a real city with San Francisco and then like this massive suburb surrounding it, which makes sense if you are in a place like Phoenix, where you are just surrounded by essentially unlimited unincorporated land. You can just buy up desert and build on it, right? But even then you hit a threshold where like, if you're building suburbs, quote unquote, that are 2 hours from the city center, how useful is that to you? You know, you're gonna have a 4-hour commute every day. You know, it's that, you know, you hit a limit of viability where it's just not useful anymore. And I would say that for us, we're not necessarily at that like concentric circle problem of like the outer suburbs are too far from the inner core. I live in South San Jose, and it's only a 10-minute drive for me to get to San Jose. It's only about 55 minutes without traffic for me to get to San Francisco. So it's not like super unreasonable for a lot of where the people live in terms of distance, but we're just out of buildable space. So what do we do? Well, what we have done is kind of nothing. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's housing development happening in the Bay Area, but it's way dwarfed by the population growth that we've seen, to the point that, these numbers imply that like I'm only tracking since 1991, but that's because that's when we have numbers. If you go back further, the housing undersupply was worse in 1991 than it was in 1981, worse in 1981 than it was in 1971. This is like a 60, 70, 80 year problem. But we are at historic lows in terms of the available housing units here in the state of California. And if you look at the various areas here in the Bay, or just look at it regionally, there really isn't a region anywhere in California, which includes like the Central Valley and other places that we don't regard as especially attractive to live, where we are not at historic lows in terms of housing availability. California ranks 49th out of 50 states in terms of housing units per capita. And we are short about 2 million units. In fact, according to a report from 2016, we would need to build 3.5 million new homes by 2025. To give scale to that, there are only 14 million housing units in all of California. So we would basically need to build, what is that? Almost a third of our additional housing units again, just to keep pace with population growth. And all that does is level off like the housing costs at the already unreasonable levels that they're at. If we want to actually bring housing costs down, we have to build more than 3.5 million housing units in the next 4 years, which, you know, without trying to be too cynical, is not going to happen. So what impact does this have on the state? California loses about 6% of its total state GDP every year due to housing. And it's a single digit number, so it doesn't sound that low, right? Like if we did something nationwide that lost us 6% of our GDP, that would probably be more wealth destroyed in about a 1 or 2 year period than we saw destroyed by coronavirus in this past year. With the $140 billion that we are losing every year in state housing, we would have enough money to send every person who wants to go to a public university in California for free, house every homeless person for free, and provide health insurance to every person who doesn't currently have health insurance with money left over. It is a preposterous amount of money that we are leaving on the table every year by not taking care of these shortfalls in terms of housing. The magnitude is enormous. So how did we get this way? How did we get to this point? Prop 13 is not the contributing factor, but it is a major exacerbating factor in the sense that it does a couple things in terms of it incentivizes people not to move. It incentivizes people to keep holding on to their homes, even if they don't need them anymore, or even if their family has kind of outgrown it and it's a bigger house than they need or something like that. But the bigger thing that it does is it creates perverse incentives for localities. Here in San Jose, they are constantly building new industrial parks and commercial space. And the reason for that is because commercial property generates way more tax revenue on the margins than residential property does. But that creates a situation in which there's like kind of more commercial property than we need alongside all this residential property that that we're not using. So vacancy rates from commercial properties are often 2, 3, maybe 4 times higher than what you would see for residential properties. There's also problems with onerous regulations. Things like having a certain amount of parking required to be provided for every unit that you build, or requirements that you can only zone for single family. Both of those things create major burdens to building up greater levels of density, which again, if you are going to build up, that means building density. There's also the problems of like environmental regulations and building codes, but really those are a very small contributor in the long run. It is true that California has the most expensive construction costs anywhere in the country, but we also have the highest housing costs of anywhere in the country. So it's not like if you're a building developer, you're thinking to yourself, God, geez, all those like, insulation provisions or like earthquake protections, that's cut into my margin so much, it's not worth it for me to build. No, if you're going to be able to sell a house for $700,000, even if it's costing you $400 a square foot to build it, you're going to make money on that development. So in general, it's more so the regulations that cause this problem, and specifically the requirements for single family zoning. But I would call that approximate cause, not an ultimate cause, because it's not like the regulations come from nowhere. The regulations come from us. And I mean that very literally, because almost all zoning control is done at the local level. So while we talk about California's regulatory hostility, in reality, what it is a patchwork of different cities, towns, counties, and municipalities that are creating this environment. But again, I would say that that's not the ultimate cause either, because California is not unique in its implementation of local control of zoning. I personally believe, and there's evidence to back this up, that the kind of level of NIMBYism, hostility to new development, hostility to higher density development, is the result of economic and financial anxiety. We live in a world of, don't get me wrong, quality of life is higher today than it was a generation ago. There's no way to argue that it's not. But the fail-safes that were in place a generation ago are no longer present. So, and I'm not suggesting that we go back to single income households, but one of the benefit of a single income household is if one partner gets laid off or gets sick or gets hurt, the other partner could then go into the workforce. Or if there's a family member who's extremely sick, or who is extremely or just disabled, or in some other way needs constant care, that could have been done by a family member 40 or 50 years ago. Today, when almost all families are either single parent households or two income households where both partners are working, that failsafe is no longer in place. And we haven't come up with any societal mechanisms to kind of fill that gap. So let's say you've got an older parent who requires constant care and attention. Maybe that would have been provided for by a family member 50 years ago. Well, now that's being provided by an in-home, a home health aide or something like that, which is extraordinarily expensive. On top of that, we have transferred responsibility for people's long-term economic welfare from either the government or institutions like the companies that they work for to individual people in a process known as asset-based welfare. In general, the government encourages you to curate your own retirement, your own long-term economic well-being. And if you are a financially responsible, financially knowledgeable individual, this has worked out relatively well for you. 401ks, 403bs, IRAs, these are all great instruments for building up long-term wealth. But the fact of the matter is, most everyday people find those instruments extremely intimidating and don't engage with them all that much. Why does that matter? Well, those instruments were promulgated in the 70s and the 80s as a supplement to our existing system of Social Security and the relatively large number of people that had defined benefit pensions. Today, Social Security still exists, but it is less financially solvent than it was 40 or 50 years ago. And much more importantly, the number of people with defined benefit pensions in the United States has gone down by 70 or 80%. Almost nobody has a defined benefit pension today, whereas in the 70s, maybe about a third of the country did. So what does that mean? That means that for a huge proportion of Americans, the only form of asset wealth that they have is their house. So they become extremely risk averse to anything that might change their community and impact the value of their house, even things that might raise the value of it. Like if you live in an area where density is going up, do you know what density does to land values? It increases it in the long run. So ironically, people fight against density, and it's usually motivated by fear of what's going to happen to their home values, when in reality, it's probably actually going to raise their home value. But the headspace that most people are in is like, I need this asset to stay valuable because it is basically the only asset that I own. It took me years and years of saving, or a couple lucky breaks for me to even be able to afford this house in the first place. So I can't let people come in and play with the area around my home if it's going to have impacts on the most important investment that I am ever going to make. All of that would have been true of somebody who owned a home 50, 60, 70 years ago, but it probably would have been an asset that they own instead of the asset that they own. So this creates kind of like a non-virtuous cycle of like people trying to protect their most valuable asset, locking their communities in amber, which makes it so that no new assets come on the market. So when people do buy a home, they're way in hock for it, which makes them even more protective of the house that they own, and on and on and on down the line. It's a bad cycle, and I literally don't know what happens if we don't break it. It's a really weird problem to say that like housing prices are only high because the place that we live in is so economically vibrant. But what happens when literally any nurse, any police officer, any teacher, any stereotypical middle-class person is locked out financially of the place where we are? Like on a long enough timeline, that seems to be unsustainable. So what do we do? I'm going to use a case study of Santana Row in San Jose. Not because I think Santana Row is so rip-roaring awesome, but because I think it highlights what it is that I'm talking about. Santana Row is obviously like a very bougie, very planned like location, and it's very unlike the community that's around or anything like that. It's got a Prada store. It's got like an Amazon bookstore. It's got a what's a Tesla dealership. You know, it's obviously like it's conveying a very specific thing. But it is also a walkable community, mixed use with shopping. And if more of the area of Santana Row was like it, you could probably get by with fewer cars per family. So families that have 2 cars might be able to get by with 1. Families that have 1 might be able to get by with none. And the fact of the matter is, even by San Jose standards, which are already ludicrous, the rents that Santana Row is able to get from people are off the charts crazy. You know, a good probably $1,500, $2,000, $2,500 more than average per unit. So what does this demonstrate? It demonstrates that there is this huge pent up demand for this style of city living here in the Bay Area, which necessarily begs the question, why have we normalized car-centric single-family homes with relatively large yards and other accoutrements? Why have we made that the normal way of living? And why have we then turned into smaller, mixed-use, walkable communities into a luxury item? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Shouldn't you be paying more for the yard? Shouldn't you be paying more for the single-family accoutrements? Shouldn't you be paying more for a car-centric lifestyle? Cars are expensive. Yard maintenance is expensive. Richer people should want those things, shouldn't they? But there's like so much of that we've actually created a weird situation in which the way most of the rest of the world lives is a luxury item here. So that's kind of an interesting way of doing our planning, isn't it? So what can we do? There are like relatively low touch things that we can do to improve this process right now, but even these have been pretty roundly rejected by the voters. So building on vacant urban space, upzoning areas that are near transit, near trains, near buses, adding units, accessory dwelling units to single family homes, adding units to underutilized urban and land zone developments, things that we can do with the existing land that we have now. What's ironic is that this wouldn't be enough, like not even close to enough. And even these things have been rejected. And that's a big, big problem. Because if we're going to reject even the lower touch things that we're going to do, this does create a situation in which that kind of transformation, like we saw in New York City between the late 19th and early 20th century, that can create a situation in which we're not willing to make the changes that have to be made. And we have let this build up for so long that we need actually pretty robust, over the top kind of policy remedies to do something about this. So things that we can do are kind of take zoning decisions out of the local government's hands, which I'm guessing in a Chamber of Commerce is not going to be a very attractive option. Other things that we can do is accelerate land use approvals. But finally, we need to do things to raise overall construction productivity. If we're making construction super scattershot and only happening in small little pockets across the city, then you don't get agglomeration benefits. You don't get it cheaper on a per square foot basis. If we can get lots of production happening simultaneously, there are sort of scaling benefits that happen with that. Things like modular construction, accelerated construction permitting. It's a mindset more than it is anything else. It's making it so that creating new housing units is a priority, which it's not right now. So that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it off. I apologize if any of this was, frustrating or controversial, but I'm happy to just take questions or let you kind of discuss amongst yourselves or whatever. And thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Matthew. Honestly, as you were speaking, I had like so many thoughts and things going through my head. And when you posted the photo of New York, the before and after, it brought me to a flashback or PTSD when I used to attend planning meetings, and when they were talking about 5-6 stories along El Camino, it's like, no, we're going to be New York City. So I needed to do a little therapy session on that one, but I will. Are there any questions or comments from the group? There were some chat boxes. People were referencing how, yes, density, smaller units, the density, walkable cities. And I guess they're talking about New York, where you can get to things within 15 minutes. Any reactions or thoughts? Feel free to just unmute yourself. I see some realtors have joined us. Hi, Barb. Well, Matthew, so I've heard a lot of these things, same things throughout the years, and I think people know what we have to do, but there were so many regulations. In New York, they were kind of built, I mean, I guess around like the transportation. Like, I am not a subway person. When I visit New York, I will gladly walk or Uber or taxi everywhere because it's an old school feeling of hailing a cab. But you can walk everywhere. You can go anywhere. And in California, I mean, I live in Daly City. I'm not walking to San Mateo for pizza. We need the transportation too, and I think in order to do things, we need to change the mindsets of people, and it's a little hard. And I know from experience, rent is so expensive. Like, I know that the parents, the older generation who have their home are now becoming multi-generational households because of that same issue. So then the parents who do want to sell their house are like, oh, we really can't because our family lives with us, and what can we do? And so every time someone mentions Prop 13, my mom's like, oh no. And so you're just kind of caught in the cycle. So I don't know, there's probably a question in there somewhere, or it could just be me commenting, but I don't know if you want to respond to any of that, or if that kind of got anyone else thinking about a question they want to ask.
Well, Gary has his hand up, so I'll go to that in a second. But specifically to what you're talking about, the transportation, it's not like New York built a subway and then they're like, oh, by the way, let's build up some density around it. The subway became viable because the density had started. So the two grow up together. Like, part of the reason why mass transit in the Bay Area is not equal to like how great a city the Bay Area is, or how great a locale the Bay Area is because we don't have the density to justify it. You really can't do subways or commuter rail on a large scale, or like if you look at the the light rail in San Jose, like, it's there to have it, like, it doesn't, if you ever ride it, it's very rarely full, it's like not that useful, you know what I mean? And the reason is because they built it, like, the light rail in San Jose runs along the highway. People don't live near the highway. People live in the core, you know what I mean? So when it really is a chicken and egg problem, in the sense that, like, you can't wait for one to happen. They kind of have to grow up together, you know what I mean? And so, like, that's why the existing proposals usually involve highlighting existing cores where transit actually is viable and building those up even more, which will make transit even more viable. Then we can employ things like trolleys, or maybe even subways long term. Even if you specifically won't ride it, maybe somebody will. But yeah, it's I guess did you want to call? I don't know who's moderating. Am I?
Gary, do you want to go ahead?
So Alex just dropped his video, but I was going to try to put him on the spot and tell us a little bit about SB 9. It's generating a lot of controversy, of course, and that is the state's approach to try to build some housing. I don't know if Alex is going to be interested in responding to that, but
let's find out. Alex, are you on the line? Are you? You may have.
Sorry, just came back.
SB 9.
SB 9. What do I have to say?
Well, where do we stand on that now?
Huh? Senator Becker hasn't taken a position on it yet. We've actually been speaking with a lot of our local electeds and community groups and like neighborhood members about it to hear their concerns. And obviously there are significant concerns about that and SB 10 also. So the Senate doesn't have an official position, but any thoughts you guys have, I'm happy to talk to you either here or some other time. We can certainly.
Alex, for the folks that may not know everything about SB 9, can you just say it in a nutshell?
So yeah, so SB 9 would allow by right for a property to be subdivided, a residential property to be subdivided into two properties, with the possibility of putting a duplex on each of those properties, or you could just put a duplex on the one property without subdividing it. But the goal would be to create the number of units, or to increase the number of units on a property from one to possibly 4 or maybe more, depending on how you count junior ADUs as a separate unit or not. Those are much smaller units that are attached to the main unit, but it would certainly allow up to at least 4 residential properties on a current lot. So
I'd like to get Matthew's response to that thought, because that gets at this protecting the assets that he mentioned, that people have the anxiety about losing the value of their primary asset.
There's a behavioral question here, and then there's like a policy question here. From a behavioral standpoint, people live here because they like it as it is. Like they like the Bay Area. That's what they selected into, right? And that's fair. Like, I totally understand that. I don't want the place that I grew up to change either. You know, I liked it the way it was. That's why I chose to live there. That's why my parents chose to live there. So there's just sort of a function of the human condition here, in the sense that, like, no, seriously, like this is just a normal human desire to like raise your children in the place that you were raised, to find the place that you were beautiful, and to preserve what you find beautiful about it. You know what I mean? So I 100% get that. From an economic perspective, from a policy perspective, you really can't argue that if you can build more units on a given parcel of land, that the value of the land is going to go down. That's true that they'll have to be
value.
What's that?
That's the neighbor's value. It's not my value.
Well, what do you mean?
Well, as long as I'm there, unless I sell.
If you choose not to subdivide.
Choose not to sell or subdivide.
Yeah, and that's real. But like, in the long run, I think people feel that will be detrimental to their home values, but there's not a lot of evidence that it actually will be. Like, you know, I guess people are worried about the nature of the people that move in, or the quality of the community, or things like that. That's all fair. But when you create land that can hold more housing units, the land becomes more valuable. So it's true that if you just sort of like, on that long run, systematically refuse to subdivide or build higher density, I don't know exactly what happens to the value of the home. I would guess that for most homes, it still doesn't go down, but maybe. I don't, you know, this really hasn't been, we don't have a lot of historical precedent for a situation in which a place just kind of systematically refuses to upzone density for like 80 years, and then suddenly we do it. Like, Minneapolis just got rid of single family zoning recently. So it'll be kind of interesting to see like what happens there. But like, when you look at places like Houston or Austin, which really don't have land use regulations kind of at all, I don't know if you can find much evidence of houses, even when they don't upzone for density, that the surrounding community upzoning for density negatively impacts their property values. I mean, maybe there are pockets where that's been true, but in terms of like systematic, wide-ranging evidence that occurs, I'm not aware of that. Now, that's with the caveat that we haven't done this that much, so I may very well be wrong. But like, I think more so it's the behavioral aspect that's driving this, the desire to preserve our communities as they are, more so than the economic considerations that are driving things. Because in the long run, higher density is kind of good for the economic viability of at least a parcel of land that you own, if not the actual literal home that you exist in. But from a policy standpoint, there's only so much we can do to preserve that if we care about this problem. You can just say you don't care about the problem, which is totally fair. But like, we can't have one-story bungalows, like as far as the eye can see, and deal with this problem. Like, it will have to change, or the problem will continue to get worse, and that's a choice that we'll have to make.
And that is the problem. Is the reality is there's a lot of resistance because people don't want that change. So there's got to be some middle ground here where you can get some of that, what you need. I mean,
I think we're kind of talking about the middle. This is middle ground, kind of. Like, yeah. The more extreme remedy is to do away with single family housing and kind of require mixed use development along transportation. Like, all we're talking about here is giving people the option. So a middle ground between that and where we are now is, I don't even know exactly what that looks like. And I don't know how effective it would be about at ameliorating housing cost issues.
Dennis, you were going to speak?
Hang on, I saw Jonathan nodding and I'd like to hear him chime in on NIMBYism. What do you think, Jonathan?
Thanks, Dennis. You know, this is really,
It's
this
a
is the
conundrum.
toughest issue.
It's a conundrum.
This is the toughest issue I think that the city is facing. And I feel like both sides of the issue are not really talking to one another. I will go to seminars held by so-called NIMBYs, Livable California. I will go to seminars held by people on the other side. There is a lot of invective when there'll be a reasonable presentation, which you may or may not agree with, but then members of the audience will chime in and start saying things about people who believe the opposite way. And of course, we see this nationally in politics as well, but it's really discouraging. At the end of the day, though, we have a problem. And we have a problem because the way that we have lived, the way that we have structured our communities is not working based upon our current population and other complexities that Matthew touched on here. If we do not manage change, change is going to manage us. And a very strong, compelling argument can be made for local control. I mean, communities should be able to control the scope and shape of development. But as Sally Meadows pointed out at one of our recent council meetings, if you're going to have local control, you also have responsibility. And I think that we are seeing the state sort of take away a lot of the opportunities for local control because local communities have not been working to solve the problem. What I'd be very interested in hearing, Matthew, is I see really two problems here, big problems. One is a lack of housing altogether. And I think you've done a very good job touching on that. But there's a second problem, which is not just a lack of housing, but a lack of affordable housing, a lack of below market rate housing. And as far as I can tell, the only way to really solve that problem is to tinker with the market. We live in a capitalist society, and property owners, developers, they're willing to build projects that make money, where there is a reasonable rate of return. And the below market projects usually don't have a rate of return that pencils out. That's why we have, what is it, Measure A in Santa Clara County. We have 330 Distal, which is going to be built in the next several years as one of the measured projects. But without that government incentive, we're not seeing units being built for the people, not just the teachers and nurses, but people who make even less money, the gardeners, the restaurant workers, the beauticians. Where are they going to live? Because they're going to get tired of commuting from Los Banos and Gilroy all the way out to Los Altos Hills, Palo Alto. I think that is another huge problem, and I wish that I would hear more debate about that as well.
Matthew,
I totally agree.
Matthew, I'm sorry. I hate running over, so I will give you a minute to answer that wonderfully easy question that was just asked.
I started with a comparison to New York City, and I specifically did not use the scare phrase public housing. New York City on a per capita basis has way more public housing than the Bay Area does as well. First and foremost, it's still a supply problem. Housing supply in general means that, the luxury, there's more luxury units. That means people that are forced to buy luxury units move to mid-level units. People that are forced into mid-level units go down to lower income units. So that's all very much true, that that gets ameliorated to some extent just by having more housing, period. In terms of creating opportunities for developers to create below market housing, the take up of that has been really bad. I had a whole slide that I decided not to include about how just a teeny proportion of Los Angeles County are these below market units. And every 5 years, they usually go into a 5 or 10 year time horizon, and then they cycle out immediately. They instantly walk away from those systems because there's just so much more money to be made at market rent housing. Y'all have tried the incentive. Look, I don't need to like win voters so I can say things that you're all gonna hate to hear. Y'all have done a lot with the incentive side. If the carrot's not working, it might be time for the stick. You know, I don't know. Like there's obviously, you can build below market housing profitably. Anybody who tells you otherwise is lying. You can't build it as profitably as luxury units. And that's just kind of the reality of the circumstance. So like, I don't really know why the take up of that is so poor, but I do think if there's just more housing generally, that would break up some of the lock in the system, and it might be easier to get those subsidies to, like, you know, on the margins work the way that they were intended to work. But I genuinely don't know. It's definitely a problem.
Well, I think we could go on forever on this topic, and some have in some cases, but I think, Matthew, thank you so much. I think this was stimulating a lot of, I think there'll be a lot of takeaways, hopefully definitely some good food for thought. Kim, if you want to wrap it up in like 30 seconds, give us anything you want to just tell the chamber.
Yeah, even shorter than that, actually. I just wanted to remind everyone, we have a social media summit tomorrow that we're offering it's a insightful one-day conference, basically to help create content, whether it's email marketing, social media marketing, and whatnot. I provided the link in the chat. You can register for that if you would like to participate. We'd love to have you. And that's all I have. Thank you so much. Great to see everyone. Thank you so much, Matthew. Really incredible presentation.
Very much.
You're welcome, and I'm sorry.
Matthew put his email in the chat box, copy, paste it, send him an email. Thank you again. And thank you everyone for staying with us a little over. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Kim.
You mean Bruce?